The dirty-handed boy who fixed a $500,000 Rolls-Royce and made the millionaire. Question his entire life. The city of New York never sleeps. And it never stops judging either. Every single day, millions of people walk past each other on the streets of Manhattan without making eye contact. Everybody is somebody, or pretending to be somebody, or desperately trying to become somebody. The unspoken rule of New York City is simple. If you don't look the part, you don't get the part. Nobody understood that rule better than Richard Harmon, and nobody was about to break that rule more completely than a 12-year-old boy from the Bronx named Marcus Webb, the man who had everything. Richard Harmon had not always been rich. That was the part he rarely talked about anymore. He had grown up in a small apartment in Queens, the son of a postal worker and a school cafeteria manager. They were good people, honest, hardworking, loving, but money was always tight. Richard remembered wearing his cousin's old clothes to school. He remembered his mother counting change at the grocery store checkout. He remembered promising himself at the age of 9 that he would never feel that powerless again, and he had kept that promise. By the time he was 30, he had flipped his first commercial property in Brooklyn for a $2 million profit. By 35, he was running a real estate development firm with offices in 3 states. By 40, he was worth over $1 billion. By 44, he was one of the most recognized names in American real estate, with a portfolio valued at $2.3 billion and a reputation for being one of the sharpest, most ruthless dealmakers in the business. He had earned every penny. He never forgot that. But somewhere along the way, in the private jets and the penthouse dinners and the boardrooms full of people who competed to agree with him, he had also forgotten something else. He had forgotten what it felt like to be overlooked. The morning everything stopped. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp, golden New York morning that makes you feel like the city is showing off. Richard was already in a bad mood before he left his Park Avenue apartment. His driver, a reliable man named Earl who had worked for him for 6 years, had called in sick at 6:45 a.m. His backup driver wasn't picking up his phone. His assistant had arranged a car service, but they were running 20 minutes late. Richard decided to drive himself. He never drove himself anymore. Not since he bought the Rolls-Royce Cullinan 2 years ago. Matte black exterior, chrome spirit of ecstasy hood ornament, custom cream interior with hand-stitched leather. It had cost him $487,000, and he had paid for it in cash without blinking. He had a board meeting at 9 a.m. that would finalize a $400 million acquisition deal, the biggest single transaction of his career. He needed to be sharp. He needed to be early. He needed everything to go perfectly. Instead, at exactly 8:12 a.m. in the middle of Fifth Avenue, the Rolls-Royce simply died. No warning light, no sputtering, just silence. Like the car had made a quiet, personal decision to stop cooperating. Richard sat in the driver's seat for 3 full seconds, unable to process what was happening. Then he tried the ignition again. Nothing. Again, nothing. He got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk, one hand loosening his tie, the other pressing his phone to his ear. 3 of his associates, men who had been following his car in a separate vehicle, pulled over and joined him on the sidewalk. They stood there in their expensive suits, completely helpless, watching taxis swerve around the motionless Rolls-Royce, like a river going around a rock. The mechanic his assistant called was 45 minutes away. 45 minutes, Richard said, loud enough that a couple of passing tourists looked over. Janet, do you understand what 45 minutes means today? Do you have any idea what is at stake this morning? His associate Douglas, a large man in a green tie who had an MBA from Wharton and absolutely no practical skills, tried to look under the hood and immediately admitted he had no idea what he was looking at. The other 2 associates stood with their hands in their pockets, looking at their phones. The minutes ticked by, and that's when Marcus appeared, the boy with the toolbox. He had been watching from the sidewalk for almost 4 minutes before he walked over. Marcus Webb was 12 years old, but he carried himself with the quiet self-possession of someone much older. He was not a big kid, slim, medium height for his age, with careful dark eyes that missed nothing. He wore a faded green t-shirt with a small tear at the left shoulder. His shorts were work-stained. His sneakers, white once long ago, had seen hundreds of days of hard use, and the left sole was beginning to separate at the toe, held together with a strip of black electrical tape applied with neat, careful precision. He was carrying a metal toolbox, small, rectangular, scratched from years of use. But if you looked closely, and nobody on that sidewalk was looking closely at Marcus Webb, you would notice that the toolbox was immaculately organized, every tool in its place, nothing rattling loose. The kind of order that comes not from obsession but from respect, from being taught carefully and repeatedly that your tools are your livelihood and you treat them accordingly. Marcus had learned that from his grandfather, Joseph Webb, who had run a one-man auto repair shop in the South Bronx for 31 years. Marcus had been helping in that garage since he was 6 years old. By 8, he could change oil and replace brake pads. By 10, he had rebuilt a carburetor from scratch. By 12, he had developed the instinct that separates good mechanics from great ones, the ability to listen to an engine, to read the small signs, to understand what a machine is trying to say. He had been walking past this intersection on his way to school when he saw the Rolls-Royce stop. He had watched it happen. He had heard the engine cut out, not a dramatic failure, but a quiet one, clean, specific. He already had a strong suspicion about what was wrong. He walked up to the group of men. "Sir," he said, addressing Richard directly, "I can fix this." The laugh. What happened next was the moment Richard Harmon would replay in his mind for years. He turned and looked at Marcus. He took in the torn shirt, the dirty shorts, the taped sneaker, the small worn toolbox. He processed all of this in approximately 1 second, and then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who found the situation absurd and who could not connect the image in front of him with the claim being made. It was the laugh of someone who had spent so long surrounded by people who looked the part that he had completely lost the ability to see past appearances. His associates joined in. Douglas made a comment under his breath. One of the others smiled and looked away. Marcus stood completely still. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He looked like someone who had expected this response and had already decided it wasn't going to stop him. "I've worked on this engine model before," Marcus said, steady and clear. "I'm pretty sure it's the fuel pressure regulator. When the temperature drops overnight and then rises quickly in the morning, the seal can get brittle and fail. It causes a clean engine cutoff. No warning lights, no misfiring, just stops. It's fixable in about 15 minutes with the right tools." The laughter faded. Douglas frowned. "How old are you?" he asked. 12, Marcus said. "And where did you learn all that?" "My grandfather's garage. I've been working there since I was 6. Richard looked at the boy again. He looked at the car. He looked at his watch. 38 minutes until the most important meeting of his year. The mechanic was still 40 minutes out. He made a decision. "All right," Richard said. "Show me what you've got." 12 minutes. What followed was one of the most humbling experiences of Richard Harmon's professional life, and he had negotiated with some of the toughest people on Wall Street. Marcus opened his toolbox. He laid out exactly 4 tools on the hood of the car with the economy of movement of someone who never wastes time or energy. He pulled a small LED flashlight from his back pocket, clicked it on, and leaned over the engine. He found the fuel pressure regulator in under 30 seconds. He examined the seal, pressed gently in 2 spots, nodded once, the nod of someone whose diagnosis has just been confirmed, and began to work. He was completely focused. He did not perform for the audience around him. He did not look up to check whether they were watching or whether they were impressed. He simply worked, with the quiet intensity of someone who genuinely loves what they're doing. Richard watched him, really watched him. He noticed the way Marcus's hands moved. No hesitation. No second-guessing, no wasted motion. He noticed the way the boy repositioned his small step stool to get a better angle, without being asked. He noticed that Marcus was thinking, not just executing memorized steps, but actively problem-solving, adjusting, reading the machine in real time. Douglas started to say something. Richard held up a hand and Douglas went quiet. At the 11-minute mark, Marcus replaced the seal and tightened everything back into position. He rechecked his work twice and methodically, not nervously. At 12 minutes, he said, "Try it now." Richard got in the car. His hand paused over the ignition key for just a moment. A flicker of genuine uncertainty, and then he turned it. The Rolls-Royce Cullinan came to life with a deep, smooth, perfect purr. Nobody said anything for a full 5 seconds. Then Richard stepped out of the car. He stood in front of Marcus and he looked at this 12-year-old boy in torn clothes holding a small worn toolbox, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt exactly, something deeper, a recognition of something he had lost. Somewhere in the years of accumulating power and wealth and the habitual, comfortable arrogance that comes with both. He had laughed at this child, and this child had fixed his $500,000 car in 12 minutes. "What's your name?" Richard asked quietly. "Marcus Webb." "How much do I owe you, Marcus Webb?" The boy thought for a moment. $20 would really help, sir. My grandfather needs an ignition coil for a customer's car, and we're about $20 short. $20. Richard stood very still with that information. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a $100 bill. Then he stopped. He put the wallet back without taking anything out. He looked at Marcus again, at the electrical tape on the sneaker, applied with such careful precision, at the toolbox organized with such disciplined neatness, at the eyes that were watching him with patience and zero need for his approval. "I want to ask you something first," Richard said. "How are your grades?" "Straight A's." "All subjects?" "Yes, sir, but especially math, physics, and computer science." "And what do you want to do with your life?" Marcus paused. That pause contained years of dreaming quietly, and being told to be realistic and wanting something so badly you almost didn't dare say it out loud. "I want to be a mechanical and aerospace engineer," he said. "I don't just want to fix engines. I want to design them, build new ones, better ones, maybe work on propulsion systems someday, engines for things that fly." Douglas let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, but something in that neighborhood. Richard turned and looked at Douglas, with an expression that could have stripped paint off a wall. Douglas studied the sidewalk. Richard reached into his jacket again and this time took out a business card. He held it out to Marcus. "Call that number on Friday morning," he said. "Ask for Janet and tell her Richard sent you. I run a foundation that provides full STEM scholarships for gifted young people in New York City. Private school, college prep, university, everything covered. But they need to meet you first." Marcus took the card carefully. He looked at it. Then he looked up. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The question was genuine, not suspicious, not ungrateful, just honest. Richard was quiet for a moment. Around them, the city continued its noise, taxis, voices, the distant percussion of a construction site. "Because 10 minutes ago I laughed at you," Richard said. "And you stood right there and proved me wrong without raising your voice, without losing your focus, and without needing my approval to keep going. That's not just talent. That's not just skill. That's character. And I've spent 20 years doing business. And I can tell you, character is harder to find than money. Much harder." He paused. "Also," he added, "you just saved a $400 million deal. So a scholarship is honestly the least I can do." For the first time since he'd walked over, Marcus smiled. Just slightly, the smile of someone who had been right all along, and had never needed anyone else to confirm it. Friday. The call, the interview, the letter. Marcus called that Friday. Janet answered. 3 days later, he sat across from the board of the Harmon STEM Foundation in a conference room on the 34th floor of a midtown office building, wearing his cleanest clothes, a collared shirt his grandfather had ironed carefully the night before, and answered every question they asked with the same calm, steady precision he had used when explaining fuel pressure regulators on a sidewalk. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Webb apartment in the South Bronx. Full scholarship, immediate enrollment, every expense covered. Marcus's grandfather, Joseph Webb, read the letter twice. Then he sat down in his old kitchen chair, the one with the cracked vinyl on the left, armrest that he'd never gotten around to replacing, and he cried. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind that come when something you have hoped for, and worked toward and prayed over finally, actually undeniably arrives. I always told you, Joseph said, his voice rough. I always told you, the right person would see you. You just had to keep being worth seeing. Marcus stood in the middle of that small kitchen and looked at his grandfather, at the grease permanently settled into the lines of his hands, at the 31 years of honest work written into his posture, at the man who had taught him that knowing how things work is one of the most dignified and powerful things a human being can possess. I'm coming back, Marcus said. When I'm an engineer, I'm going to come back and build something that makes you proud. Joseph Webb shook his head slowly. Boy, he said, you already did that a long time ago. What Richard said 6 months later. Richard Harmon told this story at a national business leadership conference in Chicago in the spring. He stood at the podium in front of 2,000 executives, investors, and entrepreneurs, and he said something that made the entire room fall completely silent. I've closed billion-dollar deals. I have hired graduates from the best universities in the world. I have sat across the table from some of the most powerful people in American business. But the best decision I ever made was pausing long enough to listen to a 12-year-old boy on a sidewalk, a boy I had already dismissed because of what he was wearing. Talent does not care about your zip code. Genius does not care about your sneakers. The next person who changes the world might be standing right in front of you at this very moment, and the only question is whether you are going to laugh or whether you are going to listen. The room stood up, but Marcus Webb didn't need the applause. He was already in class, studying thermodynamics, learning fluid mechanics, filling notebooks with designs and calculations and the careful, patient work of a young man who is not dreaming about the future. He is already building it. Some people are born into opportunity. Others build their own ladder out of electrical tape and a $12 toolbox and climb higher than anyone ever expected. Marcus Webb is 12 years old. Watch this space.